I want to welcome all of you all this afternoon, and glad you could come. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you that last night we had our kickoff for the capital campaign for the new education center at Point of Honor. I hope you all read the very nice article in Lynchburg News this morning about it. We have pictures up here of conceptual drawings of what the new building will look like. And please take time to see them if you have them. I'd like to introduce Doug Harvey, wherever he's gone, back here, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Charlotte. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us. The museum is fully open. The restrooms and water fountain are downstairs, and the exhibit down there is firefighting in the Hill City. It's items borrowed from the Lynchburg Fire Department and also their museum. So this program today is in conjunction with the exhibit that's at the local level. On the upstairs, we have an exhibit on Lynchburg in World War I, since it's the 100th anniversary, and I encourage you to go up and see that. There are also 4 galleries of Lynchburg history to the rear here. So after the program, we invite you to explore the building and make yourselves at home. We have a couple of upcoming events in October. On October 7th, we have Day at the Point. It'll be the 20th year that we welcome people to the Fall Festival at Point of Honor. It runs from 10 to 4 on that Saturday, and it's antique cars and food and beverage and living history programs and vendors. So a lot going on over there that day. And then in November on Veterans Day, Point of Honor will be open to everyone for free. When the city waived the fee in this building, we still kept a small admission fee at Point of Honor, but we waived it a few holidays during the year. So on Veterans Day, that's one of those days. And also, our curator and educator, Whitney and Laura back here, Whitney Roberts and Laura Wilson, they're working on a program for the World War I exhibit about food during World War I. And they're going to give 3 Lynchburg chefs the common ingredients of what people ate in World War I and ask them to turn it into a delicacy. And so there'll be tastings. This is going to be down at the City Market. And again, it's on Veterans Day. It's my pleasure today to welcome Robert Lipscomb to us. Robert began his career with the Lynchburg Fire Department in 1990. He's a graduate of Lynchburg College. He currently serves as battalion chief, but he's worked at just about every role, I think, in the fire and EMS service. He's a graduate of the National Fire Academy and the Fire and Rescue Management Institute at the University of North Carolina. So it's our privilege to welcome Robert Lipscomb.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Okay. Can you hear me better now? Well, thanks everyone for coming this afternoon, and I appreciate Doug's introduction. I'd like to spend some time with you this afternoon speaking about some significant fires that we've had in the city of Lynchburg and the history of the Lynchburg Fire Department. Now, one thing we do need to keep in mind is this presentation only deals with calls that the Lynchburg Fire Department responded to. So anything prior to April of 1883 would have been taken care of by the various volunteer fire departments in the city that we don't have any records of. I know the museum does have some things that relate to the volunteer fire departments, but thinking back, Lynchburg started having fire protection service in 1799. So for 84 years prior to the Lynchburg Fire Department, there was a volunteer agencies that took care of fire protection in the city. But we're going to start in 1883 and move forward a little bit to the current day. And I'm going to go over a few fires that we've had and give you a little bit of insight on what happened, where they happened, and some of the after effects that came from that. When I was asked last year to put this program together and talk about significant fires for the city of Lynchburg, that's a pretty broad reaching topic. What's a significant fire to the citizens of the city of Lynchburg? Well, if it's your house, it's pretty significant. But what I have done is I have gone through our history and I have picked fires that had an impact on the city as a whole and the department as a whole. The first one we're going to talk about is actually first fire that we went to. We'll talk about the Great Fire of 1883. We're going to talk somewhat about the Transient Bureau Fire of 1934, the fire on Main Street in 1975, and then the CSX train derailment that happened a little over 3 years ago. And I'll give you some insight into these particular fires. We are lucky as a department that we have records back from 1883. So a lot of the things that you will see, a lot of the statistics or the comments or the things related to the particular call are actually out of the records that we have. I have comments and remarks from Chief Thurman. Those were written in his hand, and I've transcribed them for you today. A lot of newspaper articles. I have things from the news and the Advance that were written the day of or the day after the fire. So there's not a lot of ambiguity as to where this came from. It either came from our records directly or came from the newspaper accounts of the day. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we're going today. And I'm going to try to do it in a little bit of a storytelling. We're going to follow along and I'm going to show you a few things and kind of do some Lynchburg history at the same time and kind of give you an idea of what the city was like at the time. So the first fire that the newly formed Lynchburg Fire Department responded to was on May 4th of 1883 on 13th Street. Now, if you go back and look at the Gray's new map of Lynchburg that's on the wall right behind over here, you will see that 13th Street in the 1880s actually went all the way through Court, Clay, all the way down to Church and Main. Today, that has been abandoned and the street doesn't actually exist. So where this fire took place actually doesn't exist anymore. It's on the old maps, but today it's gone. So I went out and I got some pictures of where these would have taken place. So this is actually 13th and Clay. This is 13th Street here, and this is Clay Street. The fire actually occurred on 13th Street between Court and Clay. So somewhere down in here between this intersection and Court Street is where the fire actually took place. But as I said, if you look at the current maps, 13th Street does not go through there anymore. It has been abandoned. And this is where we can actually see where the streets have been abandoned. This is 13th Street here. And if you look on the map, you can see where 13th stops there and starts here. And this area in here is where the street disappeared. But going back and looking at the old maps, it actually really did exist. So knowing this is Court Street and this is Clay Street, we predict the fire was somewhere in this area right here. Okay? So the fire department received a notification for this at 5 p.m. Now remember, back in the day, we had the pull alarm boxes. So someone went to the corner and pulled the box and the bells rang in the fire station for us to respond. 10 minutes later, Chief Thurman and 3 other firefighters found a fire in a 3-story brick building that was covered with shingles. The building at the time was owned by Jazz Boyd and occupied by Molly White and others as a dwelling. The value of the building at the time was $3,000 and it was insured for $1,600. And according to their investigation of the day, the fire was caused by sparks falling on a shingle roof. Chief Thurman and his men extinguished the fire by means of water accumulated for washing purposes together with a small stream supplied by a plug. And the amount of damage to the structure was $18. Now, again, as I told you, all of this information here is right out of our logbook from 1883, so I can't argue the point. If it says $18, that's fairly accurate, because all this was written in Chief Thurman's hand. So here's some of Chief Thurman's remarks after the fire, which I find very, very interesting. The supply of water is insufficient. A correct idea of what could be had from this plug, corner of 14th and Clay, however, cannot be formed, as the regular supply had been shut off at the reservoir to enable the superintendent of water and others to test the wood pump being put up for the city. This incident very naturally suggests this should be as seldom as possible, and I would respectfully suggest that when such emergencies arise, that it be required of someone to always be on hand at the proper point to turn on the water in case of an alarm. I would further suggest that also when such should be the case, or when repairs are in progress to any particular locality, that the chief be notified in writing of this fact, stating what points will be deprived of water and for what length of time. Respectfully, Alexander Thurman. So I find this very interesting in that you can see where even back that far ago or long ago, the city history shows up a lot of different places, because we're speaking here about not only the fire department, but the water resources and all of that. So I find these comments and these particular entries in the log books to be somewhat fascinating, because they tell it just like it was. So moving along to May of 1883, we call it the Great Fire of 1883. This was the first major fire that the fire department had to battle. And it did cause significant damage to 19 buildings in the 1,000 blocks of Main and Church Street. And in 1883 dollars, it was estimated to be $42,608.97 of damage, which in today's money is $966,729.47, which is a lot of damage to downtown. The significance of this fire is not only the property damage and the amount of dollar loss, but 5 firefighters were killed in this fire when one of the buildings collapsed on them. Now remember, I told you earlier that prior to 1883, the city was served by volunteer fire departments. Well, this fire occurred like 6 weeks after the fire department was formed, so we were still utilizing volunteers from the volunteer fire departments to help staff some of the calls. So in the case of this particular fire, the 5 firefighters that were killed were actually volunteers. They were not employees of the City of Lynchburg Fire Department. But since that day, we have always considered them line of duty deaths for the City of Lynchburg Fire Department. So we got the alarm at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we arrived 2 minutes later. The entire force of the fire department was there, and it was assisted by volunteers. And the first officer at the fire was Alexander Thurman, who happened to be the fire chief at the time. The first real, or if you want to consider fire truck, that got there came from the 6th Street Bridge. So if you're familiar with Lynchburg history, the 6th Street Bridge station, if you went down 6th Street to where it intersected with Commerce behind the Academy Theater, there was a fire station down there, and that's where the 6th Street Bridge station was. Because also, if you remember your Lynchburg history, there was a pedestrian bridge that went from the end of 6th Street over to Cabell Street. So that's why it was called the 6th Street Bridge Station. And according to Chief Thurman, the conduct of the men was satisfactory. So here is an image of the 6th Street Fire Station. Not sure exactly when it was taken, but these would be contemporary photos from the time. This could have been in the late 1800s, but this is effectively what you would have had. This is 5th Street Fire Station, which was Station 1 at the time. This building is actually still there. If you're familiar with where the old Trailways bus station was on 5th Street, this building is still there. It looks a little different because this parapet at the top is gone, but the fire station is actually still there. And that was one of the original stations in 1883. So, I told you the fire was in Main Street and Church Street, 1,000 block of Main and Church. This is the 1,000 block of Main Street. This is 10th here, and this is 1,000 block of Main right here. I'll show you here in a minute a little more as to where the particular buildings were. But these 2 lots here this is 1001 Main and this is 1003 Main. And this is where the fire started, was in this block of Main Street. And this was taken about a month ago. So, I told you earlier that 19 buildings had been affected by this fire. These are the addresses that were affected by the fire in 1883. So it did go from the 900 block of Main all the way through 10th Street, Church Street, and then back down Main Street. So what I want to do with you now is I want to walk you through this and kind of give you an idea of what happened, where it happened, and so forth and so on. This is a current aerial view of where this happened. If you can see, this is 1,000 block of Main right here. This is 1,000 block of Church. This is 11th, and this is 10th. This is City Hall, and then this would be Monument Terrace back down here. Okay, so you kind of clear where we are? as far as your geography goes. The fire started at 1003 Main Street, which would be right here. It was owned by Jones Watts Brothers as a hardware store. At the time, the value of the building was $11,000 and the fire did $6,000 worth of damage. The fire then spread to 1001 Main Street, which happened to be the Virginian newspaper. It was owned by Mr. Button as the newspaper and printing offices. That's where the Virginian was right here on the corner. The value of the building, that building was $10,500 and it was a $9,500 loss. So those two buildings right there on that corner had significant fire damage. Fire then moved up 10th Street to 208 10th. Address does not exist anymore, but this was owned by Mr. Charles Button, and it was, the loss figures were actually included in the 1001 Main Street, and it was a tailoring establishment on the corner there. Fire moved back up 10th Street to 212 10th, and this was owned by Lynch's estate, and it was occupied as a bar room. And the value of the building then was $2,500 with a $1,956 loss, and then lost a fair amount of his stock as well. Now we're starting to come down Church Street. We're in the 1006 area. This was owned by Mr. Moore and was owned by Peters and Flood, or occupied by Peters and Flood as a tobacco manufactory. And the value of that building was $11,000 with a $3,700 loss. And then he lost a fair amount of his stock as well. We moved back down Church Street to the corner, and that was owned by Mr. Dudley Dunbar as a stable. And we had a total loss there, both of the building itself as well as the feed. We come back down 1001 Church Street, back over in this area. It was a brick and wood building. It was a family residence owned by Dr. Fletcher and was a total loss. There was an office in the square on Church Street between 9th and 10th, which would be somewhere in this area here, that was owned by Dr. Owens. No insurance, and we don't really have a loss value there. There was a small building in 1005 Main Street that spread to that, and that was owned by Jones D. Sutter Books and Stationery. And we had a $187.50 loss there. And his value of his stock, he lost $9 worth of personal property there. We come back up to 1012 Church Street. This was occupied as a family residence. I find it very interesting that in 1883, a house on Church Street had a value of $15,000. So it must have been quite the house to have that value at that time. She had an $800 loss. Across the street, there was a building known as Holcomb Hall. It was 1011 Main Street, or Church Street, I'm sorry. And it was owned by the city, and they had a $102 loss there. We come back over here, where City Hall is now. It used to be a building called Friends Warehouse. It was a tobacco warehouse. It did spread to that, and had a little bit of fire damage there as well. Back over on 10th Street, there's another property that was owned by Friends Warehouse. It had it was a storage room of some agricultural implements, and they lost the entire building and all of the stock within it. Now we start to come back down Main Street a little bit to Lee and Company. It was a grocery store, and they had a $140 loss and lost $150 worth of stock. Now these numbers sound really small, but that's $1,883. That'd be a significant loss today for a small grocery store. 1011 Main Street, so we're still in this area right in here. It was owned by Mr. Maurice Moore and was occupied by E.M. Green as a home furnishing goods store. He had a $387 loss and didn't lose any of his stock. We come back down Main Street to 1007. That was Swiggy Machine Company. He had a $2,200 loss of his equipment. There was a kitchen in the 1000 block of Main Street, 1005. He had a total loss there. And then 10th between Main and Church, this was occupied by Jones Watts brothers. So we're back up in here, and that was a total loss there as well. And then we're coming back down to 1009 Main Street, and that was a $84 loss on a $9,000 building, and it was a residence and a barber shop. Now, the interesting thing about this particular fire is, if I will refer you back to the map over on the other side of the wall, that map actually shows all of those structures. So it's very neat to go and look at the map and see those structures, and they're actually labeled as to what they all were. So that kind of gives you an idea of the amount of calamity that this fire caused in 1883. So we burned a good chunk of this block in here with significant loss. This is actually an image of the Friends Warehouse that would have been taken sometime probably in the teens or 20s. So this is kind of gives you an idea. This is the only real image I have of anything that would have been in that area at the time. So again, Chief Thurman was very well written and well spoken. So some of his comments pretty much tell the story of everything we had here. It is with profound sorrow that I have to report W.H. Goulman, Felix DeBelver, Moore, Clements, Vaughn, firemen, volunteers, killed by the falling of walls. 2 call men, W.W. Smith and N.I. Ligon, sprained ankle, retired from service. C.M. Goldman, reel driver, cut hand, off duty 6 days. Water at its utmost capacity in consequence of necessity of attaching so many lines of hose to same main force somewhat weakened our efficiency in checking fire at one point corner of 10th and Church. Seriously impaired in view of the fact water being off plug at that point occasioned by laying of new main on Church Street. Origin of fire accidental, a piece of lighted waste coming in contact with wasted oil. So it did start in 1003 Main Street and then spread beyond that building. Again, it is but due this department to say at this time that beyond 15 call men and its complement of drivers, 1 engineer, 1 foreman, it had no regular firemen. Volunteers in a great measure had to be accepted, and the confusion, therefore, one of their characteristics to some extent prevailed. It can be truthfully said, however, that the entire capacity of the city for combating with fires was brought into action and at most advantageous points. But owing to the very combustible materials, powder and oils, a sooner check was impossible. Whilst it is laudable to report the death of 5 noble men battling as they thought for the best, it is but justice to the chief of this department to state that his orders were not observed, and their sad fate can be attributed only to their zeal, which impelled them beyond the points defined to them. Alexander Thurman. That was pretty to the point. As you read that, it sounds like it's just cold, but he tells it just like it is. He said, this was a bad fire. We had a hard time putting it out. We had a number of guys come down, help volunteer. I told them not to do it. They went in anyway, and when the building collapsed, it did kill all 5 of them. So it is very important to share this information because it does tell the complete story as to what exactly happened. Now, following this fire, there was a great deal of attention given to it by the city. There were proclamations done by city council. There were great parades. There is a great oratory that was the funeral oratory that's out there. A lot of things happened in the community. One thing that the city did do was city council had a proclamation to purchase a lot of graves at Presbyterian Cemetery. And that was done for the sole purpose of burying the firemen that died on Main Street. So this is actually the firefighters' lot at Presbyterian Cemetery, and I'll give you a better shot of it here in just a second, but these graves here are of firefighters that have been killed in the line of duty over the years. These 4 here are actually 4 of the individuals that died on Main Street. 4 of them are all buried together, and the 5th one is actually buried in Spring Hill Cemetery in the family plot. So this was one of the things that the city did do as a result of this fire, was to purchase this lot at Presbyterian Cemetery. The other thing that they did was to erect the fireman's fountain. And if you go back and look in the history books of the city, the fountain was actually planned all along. It wasn't built just for the firefighters getting killed. The fountain was planned all along, but instead of a firefighter, it was going to be a fish. And so when the firefighters died, they didn't uncrate the fish. They had a firefighter statue made and turned it into the firefighters' memorial fountain. And I don't know where the fish ended up as far as we know. Now, this particular monument or particular memorial was moved a number of times. It did end up in Miller Park in the 50s, and when Hurricane Hazel came through, a tree fell on it and destroyed it. So the firefighters' fountain now in Miller Park is actually a recreation that was done as part of the city's bicentennial. Actually, not city's bicentennial, the nation's bicentennial in 1976. It's a reasonable facsimile of the original, but that's where the original firefighters' memorial fountain was, at the foot of Monument Terrace. So the next fire I'm going to discuss is the Transient Bureau fire. And the significance of this fire is, to this day, this fire caused the most death of any fire we've had. We had more civilian fatalities at this particular fire than the city's had before or since that we know of. This particular fire started on May 24th, 1934. We got the call at 5 o'clock in the morning, and the address of this was actually 216 through 222 12th Street. That was the given address of the building. Occupied by the Federal Transient Relief Bureau, used as a shelter for homeless men, and the result again was 22 civilian deaths and 71 injuries. And the cause of the fire was determined to be a kettle of grease catching fire on the stove. This is the aerial view of where it was. So we're right here. This is Church Street, this is 12th Street, this is the Visitor Center, and this is the Armory, and then this is Community Market. This is the actual only image we have of the scene the day of or the day after. So it's very specific as to who was where. Now, one thing I do want you to note is if you look at this photo, you see the boards up over the windows here on these levels where it's blocked off. That became very significant as the fire progressed. What they did was the community was upset by the transients hanging out the windows and throwing things out the windows and making comments to the people passing by. So they put these boards and wire mesh up over the windows to keep the transients from either throwing things out the windows or making comments out the windows. That became a problem when the building caught on fire. So one thing I want you to notice, the location here, you can see the slope of the street. Take a note of that building in the background right there. You can see the roof line, because that's where it was. Okay, you can still see the roof line of the Armory. So I was able to go back to the same site. So this is where the Transient Bureau stood on 12th Street. And I know there is a marker coming soon, and it should be located somewhere on 12th in that area. So to battle the fire, we needed to use a whole lot of our resources. We ended up sending 4 engine companies, which only had 6 at the time. A combination car, hook and ladder company. The fire chief at the time was Chief Rapp. And we used over 3,000 feet of hose and 90 feet of ladders. And then all told, we fought the fire for over 2 hours. This would have been Station 1 at the time at 5th and Church. And this would have been Station 3 on Church Street. If you're not familiar with where this is where Friends Warehouse used to be, that became the fire station and the police station. And then it was torn down in the 30s, and the post office was built there, and which is now City Hall. So this was on Church Street. And this would have been a picture inside. This would have been, I referred to the combination car, this would have been one of the vehicles that did respond to the fire, along with that particular ladder truck. So these are all contemporary photos of the day of the types of vehicles or the vehicles that would have gone to that particular fire. I think the best way to tell this story is to read you the News in Advance article that was published the following day. So if you bear with me, I will read this to you. Lynchburg News, March 24th, 1934. The grease on the kitchen stove of the bureau caught fire about 4:50 o'clock, as well as it could be determined. The big kitchen stove occupied most of the space of an abandoned elevator shaft, which was converted into a flue, sweeping the flames upward. As soon as the fire flared up, Rosh, the cook, grabbed 2 pitchers of water and dashed them onto it to no avail, and he then emptied 2 fire extinguishers without any appreciable effect. His assistant, Siege Pfizer, and the night watchman, James Webb, gave the alarm. They rushed upstairs 2 stories above the fire to notify the transients who were sleeping in cots only a few feet apart and crowded together. White transients were in one section and the Negroes in another near 12th Street. Meantime, Officer J.D. Allen, patrolling 12th Street, heard shattering of glass and saw smoke spouting from the windows. He hastily turned in the fire alarm. At the first sign of fire, the men became panic-stricken. A high-boarded wall surrounded the windows, put there at the direction of transients officials to keep the men from knocking the glass out of the windows and to screen them while they were retiring for the night. In their mad dash to safety, the transients ripped off some of the boards and began leaping out of the windows. Some jumped out and grabbed a telephone cable running by the window and traveled hand over hand down to the telephone pole and hence to the ground. Many of those who jumped received broken legs, ankles, and arms when they struck the pavement below. Men with clothes aflame were seen to hurl themselves out of windows falling 15 feet or more. Officer Allen said he could hear men's arms and legs cracking as they struck the pavement. The new fallen snow was smeared with blood in many places. The fire spread with rapidly alarming. Just how much time elapsed before the men were warned and before firemen arrived will probably never be known. However, within less than 10 minutes, flames were sweeping most of the interior of the dormitories. When Fire Chief Rapp arrived, the fire was spouting out of the roof like a volcano. Immediately, he set work laying lines of hose. There was not a chance for the firemen to rescue any of the transients before quelling the blaze. That fact added to the extent of the tragedy. The firemen went at the task of quenching the fire with will, and within less than half an hour, they were able to enter the building. It was their gruesome duty then to search through the still smoldering embers to find the bodies of those who had perished. Some were burned almost to a crisp. Others would have been severely burned had not the firemen drenched the interior a few minutes before. All the bodies were removed by 7 o'clock and carried to the 2 white undertakers' establishments here. The morgues were filled with dead. Ambulances, private automobiles, trucks, and hearses were pressed into service carrying the injured to hospitals. A majority of the injured were taken to Lynchburg Hospital, others to Virginia Baptist Hospital. On account of a power line being, Memorial Hospital was without lights or power facilities and could not advantageously accept any of the patients. All told, at the end of this tragedy, this fire caused the death of 22 men and injured 71. So I apologize for how gruesome it sounds, but I believe that's the best way you can tell the story is to read it from the day. That is actually the news article that was published in March of 1934. So the significance of this fire, as you can imagine, is profound in not only the history of the department, but the history of the city as well. This is a significant event in our history that I think we should certainly remember for as long as we can, because it was a very, very bad time for those folks. So the next fire I want to talk about is going to be in the 700 block of Main Street, and this fire occurred on February the 25th, 1975. Unfortunately, this fire did not have a good outcome as well. This is the reason I put this fire in there is that this fire actually was the last, where we had our last 2 line of duty deaths in 1975. And we tell everyone every year when we do the memorial service that the names you see on the fountain, there are going to be no more. That is my goal every day I come to work, and the goal of the chief and everyone else that works there, that we will never add names to the fountain. These 2 guys are the last 2, so we plan to keep it that way for as long as we can. So these are the 2 gentlemen that died in the fire in Main Street. It was Everett Stewart and then Ronald Stevens. So the alarm we received just before 11 p.m. for a fire inside the Downtown Sound store at 710A Main Street. Now, everyone familiar with where this is? Have any idea where this might have been? It's where First Colony is, or where Genworth or Pacific Life is right now. And I'm going to go through some photos and kind of give you an idea of what was where. The first arriving firefighters could see the interior of Downtown Sounds full of smoke, and the fire had spread to Smith Studios on the west side. So west side is going to be up Main Street, and then east side would be down. The fire spread to a vacant building between Smith Studios and the First Colony Life Insurance building. The building was formerly occupied by Doyle's Florist and was being used by First Colony to store some records. Additional units did arrive on scene and began fighting the flames from the Commerce Street side of the buildings. About 15 minutes into the call, there was an explosion within the Smith Studios building next door to Downtown Sounds. Now, I will explain to you what happened, and then I will show you in the photos what happened. Smith Studios was a two-story building. Downtown Sounds was right beside it, and Downtown Sounds actually used to be an alley between two buildings, and what they did was they went in there and just put floor system and a roof system between the two buildings, put a wall on the back and a door on the front, and that became the little record store. Well, Smith Studios was a two-story building. What happened was what we call a backdraft, a smoke explosion. When Smith Studios backdrafted and blew apart, it fell down in on top of Downtown Sounds, which was where Stewart and Stevens were. So when the building exploded, it just fell right down on top of them and crushed them right there in the building. And they were both killed inside the building. Also involved in the fire was the Lynchburg Coin and Stamp Shop, along with the pencil stationery shop and a building adjacent to the coin shop. And then, as I just said, the debris coming from Smith Studios did bury Stewart and Stevens. Stevens was close to the front door, so they were able to get him out fairly quickly and took him to the hospital, but Stewart, they weren't able to recover until the next day when they got heavy equipment in to move the building material off top of him. This is the fire as it was occurring. So if you see right here, this is the Lynchburg Coin and Stamp Shop. This is Smith Studios. See where we have a two-story building here, or multi-story building? You see the little alley here? You see this door? This was Downtown Sounds. So they were went in this door to fight the fire. So this is Smith Studio again. This is the stamp shop. Back up here, back up this way would have been Doyle's Florist, and then continuing back up the street would have been First Colony. When this building exploded, it fell right down in that hole where the two firefighters were. And you can actually see the hose lines going into Downtown Sounds. This is the day after, or some days after. You can still see, this is the building that was Doyle's, Smith Studio, Downtown Sounds, and then the stamp store right there. A little better view of it. You can still see where Smith Studio is now gone, where it collapsed and fell into the hole. And then this is Downtown Sounds, and then Stamp Shop. And then this used to be, I believe the pencil was down here, and this would have been the old Doyle's Florist building, right there. What I've tried to do for this presentation is to show you the pictures from the day. This is actually at the time this happened, and couple it with what it's like today. So this is the same site today that I just showed you a little bit ago. One thing that you'll notice here with this particular building is notice the courtyard. The courtyard represents where the fire was. That's the urban myth we have heard for so many years, that First Colony did not rebuild on the site where the firefighters were killed. So if you look at First Colony Life Insurance or Pacific Life, you'll notice in that block right there where Smith Studios, Downtown Sounds, and the stamp store was, they didn't rebuild it. They built around it. Again, another view of it. You can see all the debris in the building. Again, there's First Colony. There's the old Doyle's building, Smith Studio. You can see where it used to be. Downtown Sounds, and then the stamp shop. And then we have another view of it there to kind of put it into perspective as to where we're talking about today. And not many people know that's there, but that particular plaque is right there on this building. And it says, this memorial is presented in memory of the firefighters who gave their life in the line of duty during the fire on this location, February 25th, 1975. Ronald H. Stevens and Everett D. Stewart, Lynchburg Chapter of Fraternal Order of Firefighters. So that is actually on the front of the First Colony Life Insurance building. So getting a little bit more current, most of you in here should probably remember this one. It was certainly a big deal 3 years ago. So who doesn't remember the train derailment we had downtown? Anybody not remember it? Well, April 30th of 2014, we got the call a little bit before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Beautiful day, kind of like now, cool. It's a little overcast, but not a bad day. We get a call for a vehicle fire downtown. Well, it was a vehicle fire because it actually was 104 cars of petroleum crude oil that was over a mile in length that had derailed. And 16 of the cars derailed, and 3 of them ended up in the river, and 1 of them broke open and caught on fire. So that made for an interesting afternoon because each car contained approximately 25 to 30,000 gallons of crude oil. So I'm not a good off-the-cuff mathematician, but that's a lot of crude oil that was turned over downtown back in the day. So this is what it looked like if you actually didn't know that. What you will see here is these are the derailed cars. Fire was actually on top of the water, believe it or not. It didn't burn anything but just the oil on top of the water. So we got very lucky there. And these are some of the pictures we took after the fact from across the river that show the rail tracks that had deteriorated as well as the cars in the water. And there's a nice big fire on top of the water that we were very concerned about for a short period of time until it just started burning itself out and didn't really pose any threat beyond that. So from this point forward to the end, what I wanted to do was share with you some pictures and not necessarily go over tell a little bit about them, but not go into as great a detail as I did with the others. This happened to be Memorial United Methodist Church that was on the corner of Park and Floyd. And as memory serves, this was obviously right at New Year's Eve. There were some contractors in doing some work and I think they were doing some work on the gutters and maybe soldering the gutters or doing something in the roof system. And the building caught on fire. And if you remember, Memorial United Methodist Church, after it burned, it did not reopen. It merged with Brookville United Methodist Church and is now Heritage United Methodist Church on Leesville Road. So that is that building actually, the actual sanctuary was torn down not long after the fire, but some parts of the building stood for years after the fact. And I believe they salvaged much of the stained glass, and I'm not sure where it went, but after the fire they were able to salvage a great deal of stained glass. And to kind of give you some perspective, that's where it was. That is, this is Floyd Street up here, and then this is Park Avenue. So once the church was finally demolished, and over the years, some Habitat houses went back up in that particular neighborhood. Jefferson Street, who remembers this? 1987, okay? We're standing on Jefferson Street right here, we're down toward Washington Street. And so this would be toward the river, and this is back up the hill. The fire actually started on this side of the river, we believe on the side of the road from a suspected lightning strike. The fire got so hot and burned so terribly that the buildings across the street caught on fire. And there's 2 people in here that were probably working that night or working a day or two around it that might remember that were dispatchers at the time. Right. So this is the same, going down the street a little bit. This is one of the buildings that was on, this I believe was Anheuser-Busch, the old Anheuser-Busch brewery building on Jefferson Street. And this again, this is Jefferson Street here, and we're looking back down toward Washington. So this was the train depot that sat on the river side of Jefferson Street, and you can see just it burned it end to end, top to bottom, and left nothing. And then again, the intense heat across the street caught the buildings on fire. I want you to pay attention to this view here, if you're not familiar with where we are. Again, this is the same building that I showed you just a second ago, the depot building here. This is the building we showed you a little bit earlier, which was the Anheuser-Busch building. What about this building back here? Who knows what that is? Anybody take a guess what that building is? That is the Craddock Terry Hotel. Because once all of the debris had been cleared out and the city years later decided to build a riverfront park, the riverfront park was built right on top of where that was. Okay? Now if you go down here a little bit further, you can still see this is where Bikes Unlimited and another couple of businesses are. That's the part of the depot that did not burn down. That depot was extremely long. It went from Washington Street all the way up, I think, to 8th Street. It was extremely long, maybe 9th. It was an extremely long depot, and this is the part that's left there. Same thing with Depot Grill. Depot Grill, what is Depot Grill? This is the part that didn't burn down. The depot was actually much longer beyond that, and that burned down in the early to mid-90s. So I like this photo here because I'm going to point out some things that will kind of show you how times have changed things in Lynchburg. This was in June of 1981. I show it to you because I thought it was just an interesting photo to show you some of the transitions the city's made. This is on Ford Avenue. If you're familiar, been around Lynchburg long enough, this was Kenneth Hammersley, Lincoln Mercury, Mercedes-Benz right there. Okay, and then you had the Honda shop here, and then this building is now gone. But the building burned literally to the ground. We tore it down and rebuilt on the same site. But this is what it looks like today, where they've gone back and put everything up. The Lincoln Mercury building is still up here. One thing I find really interesting about these two photos, if you go back and look, you see this stanchion here with the Pepsi sign on it. It's still there with the Manly sign on it. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. So it may have been almost 40 years ago, but things are still there that were there back in the day. Lucan's. I remember this one. This was Christmas Day, 1995. I froze sitting on the ground. I wanted to be home on Christmas Day, but that didn't work out. So who remembers the significance of the Lucan's building? Anybody take a stab at it? Yes, sir. Anyone want to take a stab at it? It was going to be Riverview's art space, and it burned down. And it threw a whole lot of, I guess it created a great deal of turmoil as to what we're going to do about Riverview's art space. The building was actually occupied by people at the time it caught on fire. And to this day, there are certain folks that believe it was arson. The building burned so hot, so fast. It's like anything we've never seen. I stood in front of the building. It was like a 7-story building. And from the time we got there, 30 minutes later, it was collapsed. It had collapsed within 30 minutes. This was a huge mill-constructed building with huge timbers, like 14 by 14 timbers. You know, floors this thick, just a huge building, and I just watched it collapse right in front of me after about 30 minutes. So, significant fire. I actually have in my possession, it was given to me by one of the old fire marshals, I have in my possession at home, and I didn't bring it with me today, is a brick from the Lucan's building that was melted. The fire burned so hot, it melted the bricks. Didn't break them, it just melted them. Incredible amount of heat, an incredible fire. So this is the site of Lukens. Actually, Lukens stood over here, and this was one of the buildings adjacent to it. And you can see this building up here on the hill. This is actually the elevator shaft from Lukens that stayed standing, that did not collapse. And then here we are today with where it was. And if you pay attention, you can see this building was there. So it kind of gives you a frame of reference for where this was. This still has not been developed in here, but the bluff walk is on top, which I'll show you just here in a second. This is, Lukens was back over this way a little bit, and these were the buildings adjacent to Lukens. And there we are now. So even though we had this tragic fire and this huge fire that caused a significant amount of damage to downtown, same thing with the Jefferson Street fire, over the years the city has persisted and prevailed and actually put something back and has recovered. And if you didn't know it was there, you would never know it happened if someone didn't go back and show you and tell you that it actually happened. So we as a city have been very good in recovering from these types of incidents, okay? But in that regard, I don't think we should forget them. I think we need to remember those and not forget them. And here's just another view, same area down on Jefferson Street. Here was the Lukens building. Here is where it stood. And then some of the buildings, this is Jefferson Street, and this would be up on Commerce. The Bluff Walk would now be up in this area. And now we have all of the parks and the buildings have been rebuilt and the green spaces have been put in and the Bluff Walk and all the apartments and the bars and the restaurants and all that. So it has recovered rather nicely downtown since these fires did happen. So I think I'm really close on, I think I'm really, really good on time here. So another picture of where Lukens was. And again, keep in mind too, that this whole area in this green space was where the railroad depots were. Because if you, where I took this picture, if you turn around, you're not far from where the railroad tracks were. So this was all where the depots were for the railroad down on Jefferson Street. So once they burned and were demolished, I know they did, that area did stay fairly undeveloped and fairly desolate for a long time until the Riverfront Park was put in. And now everything has effectively recovered nicely. So on that note, does anyone have any questions for anything that I went over or any questions for anything that I didn't go over? Yes, sir.
I'm trying to research the West End Furniture Factory fire.
Okay.
Where do I go to start looking, sir?
Was that the one on Fort Avenue right down across from Westover Dairy?
I think not, but I wasn't there. It was served by a spur line on a railroad that came from Halsey side. Somewhere near Lynchburg College, I think.
Don't know. Do you know when it was?
Probably the 1920s or earlier. I'm not asking you for the answer. I just wondered whether...
Well, if you can find a rough date as to when it occurred, we should still have the log books and have the records of it.
Call the fire department?
If you have the date. If you can, because all of our...
You know, and push 911.
Come see me afterward. I'll give you my contact information. You call me.
Thank you.
You can also reach out to us here at the museum, and we can check our records, because we have several files downstairs about the different fires in the city, more than what you covered here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any? Yes, sir.
You're probably familiar with the Academy Fire of 1910.
Yes, sir.
And a few good photos of it.
We have a few.
Probably have.
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I could spend the rest of the afternoon well into the evening. We could order pizza and sit here all night, and I could show you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of old fire department photos. I have thousands of them on my computer. Everything dating back from the 19-teens, 1920s, all the way up until current day. I have thousands and thousands of pictures on my computer. Pictures of Academy Fire, pictures of people, fire trucks, fire stations, you name it, I've got them. So, but I say we could order pizza and sit here all night, but I don't think Doug and his staff would appreciate that too much.
Anybody have any other questions?
Anything else?
thanks so much for coming this afternoon. We have some refreshments here. The building is open. And let's give Rob a round of applause.